Good morning. Over the next hour, we will learn more about the really hard dilemma we're facing in Britain as this new variant spreads. But since the scientists still don't know answers to key questions, how many people might B1.617 hospitalise or kill, how fast is it spreading, how well do our vaccines block it, then we are all of us living in a state of some unavoidable uncertainty, and that doesn't make the politics any easier. For instance, if the successful vaccine rollout has saved us, why aren't we saved? And have we really had summer freedoms dangled in front of us just to have them snatched away at the last moment? I promised you questions, I promised you some answers. I can't promise you that you'll like them. In the hottest of hot seats this morning, the Health Secretary Matt Hancock. On the latest science, the sage advisor and epidemiologist Professor John Edmunds. And from Labour, I'll speak to Yvette Cooper, chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, which has been putting the government under pressure over leaky borders. But we need to talk about other crises as well, and I've been speaking to the experienced international statesman and President Biden's climate change envoy, John Kerry. Reviewing the news ahead of pubs and businesses reopening inside tomorrow, our business editor, Simon Jack, and the deputy political editor of The Spectator, Katy. We begin a busy and hopefully informative hour with the news from Roger Johnson.
Andrew, thank you. Good morning. President Biden has spoken by phone to Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas to express US concern at the ongoing violence. Mr. Netanyahu has vowed to continue to respond forcefully to rockets fired by Hamas militants as the conflict enters a seventh day. Efforts are being stepped up to combat the increase in the Indian variant of coronavirus as lockdown restrictions are eased in England, Wales and much of Scotland tomorrow. It comes amid a huge demand for coronavirus jabs as the vaccine rollout moves to people in their 30s. The NHS says that more than 600,000 people booked their appointments in the past 2 days. A young child has died and 4 people have been seriously injured following a gas explosion, a suspected gas explosion, at a residential area in Heysham in Lancashire. The fire service was called to a row of houses in the early hours of Sunday. Firefighters were searching a collapsed property after reports of that suspected explosion. Lancashire police say a safety cordon has been put in place and nearby residents have been evacuated. 3 police officers have been injured and 20 people arrested after clashes broke out in Glasgow as Rangers fans celebrated their first Scottish Premiership trophy in a decade. Thousands of supporters took to the streets despite warnings against large gatherings due to COVID-19. That's all from me. The next news here on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. Back to you now, Andrew.
Many thanks for that, Roger. Now, the Sunday newspaper editors have mostly focused on one story, and it's the one I mentioned at the top of the show, that great dilemma about the reopening happening tomorrow and the Indian spread of the variant. There's the Sunday Telegraph push for 1 million jabs a day to save the summer, it says. The Observer has got a slightly different take. They've got a government advisor saying Boris Johnson must think again on plans to relax the rules. There'll be lots of businesses, and I'll be talking to Simon Jack later, be very, very worried at any thought that they would be changed at the last minute. The Sunday Express, very straightforward. We can't afford to panic, it says. The Mail on Sunday has got a story about royal age, the endless Harry, Meghan versus the rest of the royal family drama. But they've got a story on the front page as well. Ministers trust the jabs to defeat the variant, they say. The Sunday People, very critical of Boris Johnson. Will he ever learn? And again, attacking the government for the slowness to close the border, put India on the red list. And finally, then the Sunday Times has got a story about King Charles. When he becomes King Charles, is apparently going to open the palaces, all the palaces, to much of the public, more than they are at the moment. So lots and lots to talk about. But let's start off with that absolutely central story, which is the kind of race, as the Prime Minister put it, between the vaccine rollout and the new variant, Simon.
Yeah, I think a lot of businesses looking at the headlines this morning will have a sense of horror that the rollout may be delayed. On the front of the Sunday Express, we can't afford to panic. And inside, it says, keep calm and stick to the roadmap. The Keep Calm is from Graham Brady, the head of the 1922 committee, saying we can't afford to panic, stick to this roadmap. And there's a description of what exactly we can do tomorrow. So you've got, for example, table service to groups of 6 or 2 households indoors. You can stay overnight with another household. Slightly different in Wales and slightly different in Scotland. So have a look at your local, the rules for you locally. But I think that businesses, surely it is too late now to stop tomorrow.
I was going to say, in all candour, the restaurants have ordered the food, the pubs have got the beer ready to go. You can't at the last minute say no.
It's a big moment for them because up to now they've been able to serve food and drink outside. Now 60% of pubs and hotels don't have any outdoor space, so this is crucial to them. Yeah, but what they will really be worried about is that June 21st is the one where they can really get back to full capacity, and it does look, from what we're looking at the papers today, that's the issue now.
That's the issue.
Yeah.
And Katy Balls, what the government are really focusing on is jabs, more and more jabs, faster and faster, to allow them to do both of these things.
Yes, and in the Mail on Sunday, you have a minister suggesting that they are cautiously optimistic. Jabs could actually mean that you keep the roadmap on track, even June 21st. But it is a race. And ultimately, the good news is that generally, everyone in government is optimistic the jabs do work against this variant. So what is the fuss about? Well, ultimately, there is grave concern about how fast this spreads. And in the Mail on Sunday is looking at the fact that in areas where this has started bubbling up, so Bolton and Blackburn, the virus is spreading 3 times faster in places where the jab take-up is below 80%. So I think we're going to see a big focus in this door-to-door COVID jab blitz on not just dishing out more vaccines, but addressing vaccine hesitancy, because that is a factor here. And you have a minister suggesting they're particularly concerned about certain ethnic minority groups. And I think that is going to be as much as getting more vaccines out there, addressing concerns from those who are not keen at the moment or are worried about taking them. But I think the question for the Prime Minister is, if these plans do not go to plan, if the roadmap is put off course, will there be blame? Because there's an interesting piece in The Telegraph, which is ultimately looking at the days of inaction. And I think this goes to the questions that Boris Johnson is going to have to answer if this does get out of hand in terms of why it took India so long to be placed on the red list.
Katy, we're talking about early April, aren't we? There was a few days in early April when the government paused India on the red list and lots of people came in.
Yes, and the Telegraph puts it as the 3 days in April that that variant gained foothold in the UK. So first with the delay to put it on, but then I think interesting what the paper's focusing more on is then the fact that when it was finally put on the red list, you still had a situation where travellers from India could arrive in the UK and not hotel quarantine for several days, and that's all big rush. And I think those are the two things where the Prime Minister is going to come under scrutiny.
And Simon, there's an interesting piece in the Sunday Times, I think, on this, isn't there?
Well, they say that it was that period where 20,000 people, there we are, thanks so much, 20,000 allowed to fly into UK from India.
Yeah.
And if you remember, Boris Johnson was due to go to India for a meeting with Prime Minister Modi.
So I want to ask you about this, because there is general suspicion, widely reported in the papers, that the reason that India wasn't on the red list is that Boris Johnson was about to do a big trade deal with India, and it would have been politically embarrassing.
Yeah, he didn't cancel his trip to India till April the 19th, and then there were 4 days to allow other people to come home. And it's thought that during that period, that's when the virus got a stronghold here. And the question is the question will be, as Katy rightly says, are we putting future trade deals ahead of public health at a crucial moment?
Because at that time, as I understand it, both Bangladesh and Pakistan were put onto the red list and had much lower rates of transmission than India.
Absolutely right, yeah. They were put on 3 weeks before. Boris Johnson cancelled his trip on the 19th, but it wasn't until the 23rd that the aeroplanes from India stopped coming in.
So, as our business guru, I must ask you about another story in the Sunday Times about Lord Lister Udney, who's Boris Johnson's long-term advisor.
Yeah.
He's the guy who was with Boris Johnson in City Hall in London for a long time, and it turns out that he has been working for a luxury property company who got the government money and was in the room at a crucial meeting and didn't say so.
Yeah, he was a long-time advisor, as you say, to Boris Johnson. He was also chairman of something called Homes England, which is an agency which looks to build affordable housing. Now, he was at present at a meeting when a loan was approved for £187 million to a company called Delancey. Now, he actually said at the meeting, this is an extraordinary bit in a way, he said, I've got to let you all know, I used to work for these guys, so just so that you're clear about that. What the Sunday Times is saying is that that disclosure was not complete and that he was still working for Delancey at the appropriate time.
And he's apologised for this, but there will no doubt be Labour MPs and others tomorrow saying apology is not enough.
Yeah, he says, I do accept it would have been better for me to recuse myself. I'm sorry. The various parties to this say it didn't result in a different outcome than it would otherwise have been, but certainly it doesn't look very good at all.
So that's a kind of lobbying story, Katy. There is another kind of lobbying story involving one of my guests this morning, Matt Hancock.
Yes, something to ask him about. Matt Hancock helped Tories secure 180 million PPE deal. That's a story in the Sunday Times. And ultimately, this is involving how the Health Secretary allegedly assisted the former Minister Brooks Newmark, who was acting for a pet food entrepreneur in this PPE deal. And there's various correspondence the paper have got their hands on from aides, but also Matt Hancock. And I think there's a question, which is, why were they pushing this along so much? Is it because Brooks Newmark, or the pet entrepreneur, had great experience in PPE? That seems unlikely. And I think it's just going to feed into this idea of this fast lane for people who had links to the Tory party. And yes, we've seen Tory sleeves not dent the party in the local elections, but I do think stories like this are damaging in the long term, and there are questions to answer.
Sure. Simon, as Katy's just said, these are the kind of stories which didn't seem to cut through to voters in the local elections, particularly in the red wall seats. And the Labour Party now finds itself in some kind of leadership, not meltdown, it's putting it strongly, but a lot of unhappiness.
Yeah, the Mail on its second page, which I can't put my hands on at the moment, they say that they have lost touch with their voters. They're saying that in the red wall seats, that a lot of wokery, as they describe it, things like, for example, men who want to describe themselves as female and use female changing facilities, the pulling down of statues. Most people think that Labour voters, the Labour Party would be keenest to agree with that. And they say it's another example of the Labour Party losing touch with voters, particularly in those red wall northern towns. Although, of course, they did do better in the mayoral elections and also in the South. It's
very interesting. The Labour Party is also doing, as you say, better in some of those sort of university-dominated, student-dominated towns in the south. So you can almost see a great flipping of the traditional party
Feels
line.
like they're going like this.
Exactly. Absolutely. Katy, there's a very interesting and well-written piece about Angela Rayner, the Deputy Labour leader, and Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, who they call the odd couple in the Sunday Times. A very dramatic series of, I don't know if you can see it, graphics there. We've got it in the studio. Anyway, just talk us through it.
Yes, it's a brilliant long read, lots of great details, and it's basically going through how you went from a situation where Labour had disappointing results in the Midlands and North in the local elections to almost a full-scale crisis, which was provoked by this botched reshuffle where Keir Starmer tried to move Angela Rayner. And this obviously started last weekend, but details as to, how Keir Starmer, I don't think, realised that he was starting potentially a Labour civil war, putting his leadership in danger when he tried to do this. Clearly some animosity towards the Angela Rayner camp. And this part, which is, excruciatingly, he has had to spend the week watching Angela Rayner almost do this constant media round when Keir Starmer should be out there front and centre. And now questions being asked about his leadership. When is the crunch point? Well, some on the Labour left, the paper says, are looking to the next by-election, Batley and Spen, and if Labour were to lose that, potentially a point where people might call
another big moment. Exactly. Thank you very much indeed, Katy, and Andy Burnham making a rather unhelpful intervention in the Observer as well about all of that. Simon, just before we finish, the Palestinian news, the Palestine news overnight, again, absolutely horrible and horrendous, an attack on a tower block which included two big media organisations, including Al Jazeera. And finally, the White House seems to be getting involved and picking up the phone to Netanyahu.
Yes, Joe Biden said he's called both Mr. Netanyahu and Hamas representatives, saying, expressing his concern, particularly because the Associated Press were in a building that was hit along with Al Jazeera.
The Israelis are saying that Hamas was in the same building.
Under the same roof, and he's saying he wants to safeguard the safety of journalists in that area. But some of the pictures that we've seen, I don't know if you saw some of those
utterly
rockets
horrible.
going in.
Yeah, both kids
both
being killed on both sides.
And the Observer has a story saying that Israeli airstrikes on Gaza have claimed the lives of 39 children. Mr. Netanyahu, of course, saying they are not targeting children. They're doing their best to reduce the exposure to non-combatants.
Well, that, I fear, is a story that's going to dominate the rest of the week for many of us. Katy and Simon, thanks both very much indeed for that, and so to the weather. A beautiful, fresh and almost summery morning first thing today, but just a word to any gardeners, druids or ducks who may be watching. If you've been doing a rain dance, please stop now. Enough. Over to Nick Miller in the weather studio. Nick.
Well, Andrew, May continuing to make up for April's rainfall deficit and then some. And even today, where you may have started with a bit of sunshine, there's every chance you get a heavy downpour before the day is done. Already quite a few across southern England, South Wales. These are going to move further north and east, thundery with hail, potentially gusty winds too. They'll develop more widely across northern England. There'll be a few into Northern Ireland and northern Scotland, though actually here, perhaps more in the way of sunshine, fewer showers and some places staying dry. As for the temperatures, we're still around the mid to low teens. We are below average for the time of year. Into this evening, whilst there will be a few sunny spells around to end the day, we still have plenty of these showers. They will last well into the night across central and eastern parts of England before fading away. And I just want to give a quick rattle through next week's weather on the big picture, well, this week's weather that is. We've got low pressure very close by, so there will be further showers at times, and then this coming in for later in the week. Still something to work on in terms of the detail, but that does mean rain and potentially some very strong winds for the time of year. So a select of locations, some rain on offer most of the days, maybe a bit drier more widely on Wednesday before that next area of low pressure with the wind and rain for Thursday and Friday, and no spring warmth in sight for now. Andrew.
I wish you hadn't shown us next week. Anyway, Boris Johnson says we'll know in the next 2 weeks if the Indian variant will have an impact on the June 21st deadline when all legal restrictions on social contact are meant to end. While the Prime Minister's been upbeat, Sage has painted a somewhat gloomier picture of what might be to come. Now, Professor John Edmunds from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine sits on Sage, and I spoke to him before we came on air, and I asked him, where is this new variant now spreading?
Well, at the moment, it's quite hard to say. So we've seen an increase in cases, but reported, as you can see, there's been quite a rapid increase in cases. But many of those are associated still with the travel, particularly with India. That should tail off now, the effect of the red listing of India. So you have to really tease out which ones are associated with travel and which ones are not. And if you try and do that, and it takes a bit of time, it takes a bit of kind of old-fashioned shoe leather epidemiology, trying to find out whether a case is travel associated or not. And if you do that, then you can see that there's sort of 3 or 4 parts of the country where there does seem to be community transmission. Although there's cases in many other parts of the country, there's 3 or 4 where there's sort of looks like there's been significant community transmission. It's become seeded quite widely across the UK, and it's spreading quite. Is likely to become dominant soon.
Professor Edmunds, it's a really simple, if difficult question. How alarmed should people be, given that we've got the vaccines, we've got that protection?
Well, I think that those people who've had a dose of the vaccine should make sure they get a second dose to ensure that they are fully protected. The vaccines almost certainly do work well against severe disease. So it's very unlikely or unlikely that someone infected with this Indian variant are likely to get severe disease, but they may still get some mild disease. That is certainly possible, and some people will get severe disease. There's no vaccines are ever 100% protection. The big issue that we have is this is mostly based on kind of looking at other protection against other variants and so on. We don't have any, or we don't have very much good data against this particular variant, and that will take time to accumulate, of course.
Sure. And the SAGE meeting that you were at said that it was possible that this variant could be as much as 50% more transmissible than the Kent variant. And that got lots and lots of headlines, lots of coverage. My question is that likely, or is that a worst case scenario? In other words, how much more transmissible do you think it's going to be?
I think the evidence is stacking up that it is more transmissible than the Kent variant. It is very hard to tell how much more. What has happened is, as I was trying to explain before, you have to tease out those infections that are that have been imported into the UK, and so are just reflecting trends in other places, particularly India, and those that are have been spreading here in the UK. And if we look at that, then we can see that, as I say, there's some places that it does seem to be taking off, but those places tend to be those places that have had higher rates of infection in the past, as we've seen in the summer and the autumn. And so for whatever structural reasons,
we're talking about Bolton, Manchester and
places like Bolton, overcrowded conditions in some households and so on and so forth. They tend to have higher rates of transmission.
And this news comes right on the eve of a major unlocking and removal of some restrictions. Andrew Hayward, who's also a government advisor, is quoted all over the front page of The Observer this morning, saying that Boris Johnson must now rethink tomorrow morning's change in restrictions. What's your view of that?
I think we have to monitor this very carefully. I think we do have to, I don't think we should rule anything out. So if things look like they're getting worse rapidly, then I do think that action needs to be taken. It's very early days in this. We're looking at the really beginnings of spread of this virus in the UK. And so I think that we are still quite uncertain about many, many things, including the effectiveness of the vaccine. So I think it's very early days. I think it's a very difficult decision. There are sort of two ways you can go: try and stamp on it locally, or try to improve vaccine coverage across the UK as best as possible. And let's see how it goes.
Do you think we're still looking at a complete end of restrictions on June the 21st?
I think we'll know much more about that in the next few weeks as we see how this variant spreads and the impact that it's going to have. I think at the moment it's a bit too early to say.
And do you think all of this could have been avoided if we had closed the border to India more quickly and sharply at the time?
I don't think it would have been avoided. We could have delayed things a little bit.
So it's a very strange morning, Professor. People are looking at some quite scary headlines across the papers or on bulletins and stuff, and they're wondering, really, how worried should I be today?
I think we should be concerned, but not panicking. We're in a much, much better place now than we were when the Kent variant first hit us back in November, December. Then we had hospitals were already full from the autumn wave, and the Kent variant started spreading. So we were we weren't vaccinated. Now the hospitals are empty, thankfully, or virtually empty of COVID patients. And, 2/3 of the population, or the adult population, have been vaccinated. So we are in a much better position now to cope with this new threat, and it is a new threat, but we're not in the same position as we were back in December.
John Edmunds, I can feel myself exhaling pleasantly. Thank you very much indeed for talking to us. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Professor Edmunds there. Now, throughout the pandemic, Yvette Cooper, as chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, has put the government under pressure over its borders policy. Many had expected her to join Sir Keir Starmer's front bench after the disastrous local election results, but it wasn't to be. She joins me now. Yvette Cooper, good morning. Do you think we should be going to each other's houses tomorrow?
I think we're in a very difficult position, and we're taking the government on trust on this at the moment. I think we shouldn't be in this situation in the first place, because this was not inevitable, and they should have taken action on the India variant much earlier. They should have put it on the red list. But I think in terms of the situation now, the priority needs to be the surge vaccinations, surge testing in those areas, and crucially filling the gap in the test, trace and isolate system, which is that people still aren't often self-isolating because too many people can't afford to take 10 days off work. So I think that should be the priority at the moment, with some close monitoring. But I feel worried like other people. You may very well be right, but it's not quite an answer to my question. I said you're not on the front bench. That's very good for us, because you can say exactly what you think now. So in your guts, do you think it's right to go ahead with the great unlocking tomorrow morning? I feel worried. But I also feel like we've got a lot of businesses that have all prepared for tomorrow. There's been a lot of work done, and the government is telling us that the vaccine is currently effective against this variant, and that is happening. And therefore, I think it is right at the moment to concentrate on increasing the vaccinations, increasing the testing, filling that gap to help people isolate, but monitoring this very, very closely. Pretty much what the government is doing. You mentioned borders just now. Let me give you a sort of very general view of what people might think. This is a very
open economy, an island economy, a world island, people coming in and out all the time. It's not actually realistic to close our borders.
But you've got to have a system that works and has proper safeguards in place. So, of course, we need to continue to trade. Of course, there will be travel as part of that. However, look at what other countries that have the same geographic advantages to us have done, Singapore or Hong Kong, as well as places like New Zealand and Australia. The point is the government could have done this differently. They could have had much stronger testing and quarantine systems in place right from the very beginning. They've made these mistakes 3 times now. At the first wave, we didn't have restrictions in place at all. Okay. In March, 10,000 additional cases came into the country at that point.
The first wave, Yvette Cooper, Labour didn't ask for more restrictions then. During the summer, when so many people were coming in and out of the country, and we now know so many new variants were arriving in the country, Labour's position, so far as I can tell, was exactly the same as the government's position. And then in February, the party was calling for absolutely mandatory isolation in hotels for people coming in from anywhere in the country. Hotel quarantine for all travellers, you said. But when it came to the crucial moment of the vote, that vote where the government was actually coming to the Labour Party and saying, we need you to support our mandatory restrictions, you put no pressure on them whatever. And if I'm looking for the Labour Party's policy right now, the official policy, I look around and all I find is Sir Keir Starmer who says we need to be very careful. We need to be very careful, the Labour Party's policy?
So let me tell you my view about what should have happened on the borders and what should now happen, because there are things that need to happen now still. First of all, we should have had proper testing, quarantine and stronger restrictions, and I was calling for that in March of last year. I think we should have been learning lessons, but I was doing so from very early on, because we should have been learning lessons from what was happening in Australia, New Zealand and other countries.
Do you think that the Labour Party made a mistake in not calling for those restrictions earlier?
So I think there was an awful lot of things happening. I think the Labour Party did start to call for stronger restrictions, but you asked me for my views and I was certainly calling for those stronger restrictions to be in place. And I continued to also call for the system to be tightened, including on home quarantine through the summer as well, and to have stronger testing in place. But look, it's the government in the end that's in charge of this. Look at what they've done on the India variant. This was not inevitable. They should have put the India variant, or they should have put India on the red list at the same time as Pakistan and as Bangladesh. Since then, we've had this 3-week period in which thousands of people have returned from India, and that probably includes hundreds of the new variant COVID cases. And that's what's then causing us problems.
Matt Hancock
exactly, and that is a huge problem for us.
Let me just turn to what could happen now and what should happen now. You mentioned business travel earlier on. Is it your view that we should not be going on holidays, certainly this year, without being forced to quarantine in a hotel when we come back?
I think the government needs to slow down its plans. So I don't understand why they're going ahead with lifting some of the international travel restrictions tomorrow. I think that they should be being much more cautious about that. The things they need to do, look, we want, as the vaccine rolls out and as it's effective, if there are safeguards against new variants, of course, we want to be able to move back to international travel. But at the moment, there are some significant gaps. So the home quarantine system, for example, needs to be much stronger than it currently is. The system for surveillance, looking at what's happening in different countries, needs to be much stronger than it actually is. We have no idea what assessments the government is making, not just of India or Pakistan, but of other countries as well. They need to publish those on a regular weekly basis so that we can see what is happening and so that much faster, tighter action can be taken.
I just need the Yvette Cooper view on holiday travel, because lots of people will be watching this programme and looking at new variants changing all around the world. It's India today, it might be somewhere in Africa or the Far East tomorrow. It's always moving around the world. Is the future, candidly, for holiday people flying abroad, that they should be in a hotel quarantine when they come back? Is that the future?
We don't know where we're going to be in 6 weeks' time, so I think this has to be assessed on a month-by-month basis. But as we are now, I don't think that this is possible to be lifting the restrictions at a time when we've got so many new variants. But this does have to be continually monitored.
The trouble with that, of course, is that if people have to self-isolate in a hotel for 2 weeks when they come back from holiday. Lots of poorer people simply won't be able to afford it. Lots of people who are working won't be able to go at all. So it's a kind of an apartheid in terms of the holiday system.
So, but we have to, I think, but there's home quarantine is the other option as well. So my view has always actually been that the South Korea model is a more effective one, and that is a combination. So it does include some hotel quarantine, but it also includes home quarantine and a much stronger system of home quarantine than we have here. I think that's actually a more flexible system as you're going forward through the summer, that you can have a different mix of measures in place. But the point is to actually look at the data as it comes through and to take a much stronger precautionary approach. Most people would figure they want to be able to hug their relatives. They want to be able to go out, the kids stay in school, to be able to go out to the pub. If the price of that is having stronger restrictions at our border, I think most people would say that is the right thing to do for this summer.
Would the Labour Party be able to hold on to more northern seats if Andy Burnham was leader, as he said this morning?
But he's also said that that's not what his intention is right now. So, look, we have got undoubtedly... we've undoubtedly got some challenges. We had some tough results. We also had some good results, West Yorkshire as well.
We had some terrible results in the north, and my question is whether you need a new northern strategy.
So I think that we have to properly make sure we're addressing the lessons from the 2019 election. We haven't really addressed those scars yet.
So further decarbonisation.
For example, well, I think it's a mix, isn't it? We had issues around our leadership in 2019. We also had issues around Brexit in 2019.
You've got issues around your leadership right now, don't you? Can I ask you, your former leader, for whom you served, Tony Blair, said that the Labour Party needs a period where it is going to deconstruct and reconstruct completely. Now, is it possible to do that under the current leadership?
So I think Keir's going to be responding to that. I think that's exactly what he will do. But the question is, what do you do? I think we have not yet set out what a post-Brexit positive Labour vision of Britain actually is. People in our Leave voting areas have never heard what that post-Brexit vision is, have never heard a positive Labour vision of how we can build new partnerships post-Brexit across the world, work with countries in a different way to raise standards rather than leaving them.
That's Keir Starmer's job.
And that's what he's going to have to do.
But he hasn't
we
so
also
far.
set out a post-COVID vision which recognises that people who got us through this crisis are often the lowest paid and least valued. And actually, that has to change. I think you can set out a positive vision to do that.
We're running out of time. Why aren't you on the front bench? Were you offered a job on the front bench?
I wasn't, but that's for Keir to decide.
Have you been told that you will be Shadow Chancellor before the election?
I haven't, no. That's, I think it's for Keir to decide who he wants in his shadow cabinet and what kind of shadow cabinet he wants.
You've been very eloquent today. You're on the back benches at the moment. Would you like to be leader of the Labour Party one day?
I think we've got a leader of the Labour Party. He's getting on with the job. And actually, this is a challenge for the whole of the Labour Party to show we're a party not just of the cities, but of the whole country.
Very tactful, but not a no. Yvette Cooper, thank you very much indeed. As a former Secretary of State, the US equivalent of Foreign Secretary, John Kerry is a big figure to have taken on the role as President Joe Biden's climate change envoy. He's coming to London this week to meet Alok Sharma, President of the COP26 summit, which will be held in Glasgow later in the year. Now, Mr. Sharma has said all countries must stop using coal if they want to meet their climate commitments. And so I asked John Kerry, would the US be willing to sign up to a pledge to stop using coal to produce energy altogether?
Well, over time, that's happening anyway in the marketplace. I mean, the marketplace has made a decision about coal. You couldn't build a new coal-fired power plant in the United States because you can't finance it, nor even in Europe and other places. Korea just made a decision with respect to not funding external coal. Japan, other countries are thinking about that now. We've been pushing very hard for countries to begin to move away from fossil fuel and towards alternative, renewable, sustainable energy sources. And I think, again, the marketplace is going to be making that happen.
But that's in terms of new power stations. Meanwhile, right at the moment, you in the United States have the world's second largest fleet of coal-fired power stations, around 11% of the total. And the UN Secretary General says, and I quote, "Phasing out coal from the electricity sector is the single most important step to get in line with 1.5% degree goal." Now, if you are leading, surely you are determined to phase out coal entirely.
We are. It's already been happening. There are many of those plants that have phased out. We have about 58 of them slated for phase out now, and more to come.
Do you have a date for the ending of coal-fired power stations in the United States?
As soon as it's feasible, practicable, it's going to be happening. It's happening right now. We are moving to alternative renewable energy. Our incentives are towards renewable alternative energy. 75% of the electricity that's new that came online in the last years came online through renewables. So we're going to do what we need to do our fair share of this and to take a leadership role. And we're doing that now.
If the UK calls at COP26 for the ending of all coal-fired power stations, the United States will support that.
Well, again, what's the phase-out schedule? Is it reasonable? Is everybody working in the same direction? There are questions I'm sure President Biden will want answered, but he is leading this charge to move America onto renewable alternative energy, and we're already doing it. So I can't speak for the president on that specific proposal, but we are behaving in the way that we are talking, which is moving towards alternative and renewable as fast as we can.
There is perhaps a wider point about consumption. Now, consumption by the average single American leads to about 17.63 tonnes of CO2 every year. And that's about 3 times the average for a Chinese person or 10 times the average for an Indian person. Is the real problem, frankly, that Americans consume too much?
It depends on where the energy source is. I mean, yes, if we are producing too much carbon, no question about it. And the United States is the second largest producer of greenhouse gas emissions in the world, and we're determined to turn that around. A year ago, 2 years ago, it was 15%. It's now down to 11%. And if you look at the track that we're on, we are going to be moving very rapidly to a new economy, building out a new grid, moving towards alternative renewable energy, also pushing the curve on discovery of new technologies, whether it's green hydrogen or whatever. There are a lot of possibilities out there. Bill Gates is pursuing a small, modular, next-generation nuclear capacity. We're going to find our way to zero emissions as fast as possible. President Biden has set a goal already of getting the entire power sector of the United States totally carbon-free by 2035. And we're on an aggressive schedule already to achieve that.
Now, while US emissions overall are going down, emissions from the US agricultural sector, which is about, I think, 11% of the total, are going up, and quite sharply. Isn't the brutal truth that at some point you're going to have to tell Americans to eat less meat?
Not necessarily, because there's a lot of research being done now that will change both the way meat is produced. Cattle are herded and fed. There's research being done that actually reduces the amount of methane. So we don't know some of the answers to these, but I guarantee you the United States of America is not only setting a goal, but is moving rapidly on track to reduce all of our emissions, to become carbon-free in the power sector by 2035, and to do what other countries are doing also, Europe and elsewhere, to move as rapidly as possible to net zero. I want to, and I know President Biden wants to get there just as rapidly as we can. And he is going to push the technology curve as much as we can to hopefully come up with the new technologies which will make that happen much sooner than some of the target dates that people hear about today. We recognize that President Biden ran on this. It's one of the top 4 issues that he is focused on is the climate crisis. And he is determined that the United States will not just talk about it, but will lead in our efforts to be able to transition to this new energy economy. And I'm convinced that we're not only going to get there, we'll get there sooner than people think.
Now, it sounds to me as if you are relying very, very heavily on technology to sort all of this out, rather than changes in consumption, changes in lifestyle. I remember very vividly President George Bush Sr. saying the American way of life is not up for negotiation, period. And that is still your message, isn't it?
Well, I think there's a false choice here that you're presenting people. You don't have to give up a quality of life to achieve some of the things that we know we have to achieve. That's the brilliance of some of the things that we know how to do and will do. I think that we're determined that we'll move in that direction as rapidly as possible. But here's a reality for you and for anybody who's thinking about the rapidity of this transition. I am told by scientists, not by anybody in politics, but by scientists, that 50% of the reductions we have to make to get to net zero by 2050 or 2045, as soon as we can, 50% of those reductions are going to come from technologies that we don't yet have. That's just a reality. And people who are realistic about this understand that's part of the challenge. So we have to get there sooner rather than later. We know that. But, we look at what we did to push the creation of vaccines. Look at what we did to go to the moon. Look at what we did to invent the internet. We know how to invent and innovate. And we're going to put every effort we have into making this transition happen as fast as possible. And I'm not going to join the pessimists who think we're sitting around waiting for some new technology.
Well, of course, you are one of the most senior US statesmen in the world today, and so I must ask you directly, do you think the Middle East is now heading straight towards war?
Look, I'm hoping not, as the world hopes not. Nobody wants that to happen, but that is not my portfolio today. I'm working exclusively on the climate issue in the White House, and Secretary Tony Blinken, believe me, greatly seized by the challenge of what is happening on the ground there, and I'm sure they'll have more to add to that.
All right, Secretary Kerry, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
And my final guest today is the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock. Mr. Hancock, welcome. Is the Indian variant under control?
Well, the whole pandemic is currently under control. We are successfully keeping this down, and we've seen the fall in the number of cases. But the Indian variant, it does appear, transmits more easily from person to person. And so we have to be careful, we have to be vigilant. And thankfully we know far more about this, even though the numbers are really quite small still, because we have this huge surveillance operation.
Now, of course, the data are always, there's a bit of a lag in the data. We know about the outbreaks in Glasgow and Bolton and London. Is it possible, do you believe this variant is much more widespread in the country than has been reported?
We do think that it is relatively widespread in small numbers. And we know with a high degree of confidence that it transmits faster. And so it is something that we need to be alert to everywhere. At the moment, we need to be alert to it and we need to be vigilant. And all of us need to act with responsibility. But the strategy is on track because we have increasing confidence that the vaccine works against this virus and this variant, but the virus has just got extra legs in the race between the vaccine and the virus.
So, bearing in mind what you just said about personal responsibility, if you had elderly parents, would you go and stay with them tomorrow?
Well, if people have been vaccinated twice, and then there's been a couple of weeks after the second jab, we have increasing confidence from very early lab data. This isn't clinical data, it's from the labs in Oxford, but the early data suggests that the vaccine is effective against the Indian variant. And in fact, you can see that on the ground in Bolton. There are right now 18 people in hospital with coronavirus in Bolton. And the majority of those people haven't had the jab, but are eligible for the jab. So the really important thing that we should learn from this is that everybody who is eligible should come forward and get the jab. And of course, you should get the regular testing, especially in Bolton where we're putting, and Blackburn, we're putting huge amounts of testing.
This is really interesting and really important. Do you know how many people have contracted the new variant in Bolton who have had the jab?
We think that there are 5 people who have ended up in hospital having had one jab. And this is why it's so important to get the second jab.
Nobody who's had 2 has.
Well, we think there's one person, and but that person was frail. So the vast majority of these have not had any jab, but were eligible. So people should come forward.
I get that.
A small number have had one jab,
And then there's one case where they've had 2 jabs and they've ended up in hospital and they were frail. All of this demonstrates that the best thing that we can do is get the vaccinations out, including those second jabs, and then in the areas where we're seeing cases rise, we're throwing testing at it in very, very large numbers. And we have seen that approach work in South London against the South African variant a month or so ago.
Has anybody who's died of the new variant had 2 jabs?
Not that we're aware of. Not that we're aware of.
Isn't there a case in those areas where it's spreading so fast and where there are still lots of vulnerable people to make vaccinations mandatory?
We don't think that's the right approach, but we do.
Not?
Well, because we think that you might end up putting off more people because it would.
Are you worried about the civil libertarian backlash or a community backlash?
I'm not worried about a sort of civil libertarian backlash in the newspapers, but what I do care about is people feeling positive and optimistic about getting the jab. So the whole tone, if I could just answer this, because it's a really important point, the whole tone of the vaccination programme has been a positive one, right? It's cheerful. People come out of the jab feeling great that they've done the right thing by themselves and their nation. Yeah. And that tone has led to these spectacularly high uptakes across the board, the highest in the world by some margin. You know, we're seeing in some countries that were miles ahead of us, like Israel, their rates have really flattened, whereas we keep going up, and we've just got to keep doing that. It's a positive thing. So we're making it more accessible in Bolton and Blackburn, going door to door and making sure everybody gets the opportunity, and then it's very hard to turn
what you've said about the vaccinations is important and frankly very good news indeed. Let me ask you about something everybody watching wants me to ask you about, which is these restrictions. Are you sure, given what's going on with this, the spread of the Indian variant, that it is wise to go ahead with the unlocking at the rate that we're doing?
Yes, I'm confident that we can take the step tomorrow, but we should all be careful about how we take that step. You know, so you asked me about eating indoors with people. It's still safer to eat outdoors rather than in when the weather allows. You asked about hugging people. When people have had both jabs, then that is pretty safe.
Right. Okay.
But you shouldn't still spend a lot of time in close proximity. You should make sure ventilation's good. We all know what we can do and take personal responsibility.
And when will all those businesses desperate for the full unlocking on the 21st of June, when will they know that that's going ahead?
So we will take that decision and announce the decision on the 14th of June. And I would love to be able to give you the answer now, but we're going to use...
14th of June, what are the criteria you will use then?
So firstly, is the vaccination programme on track? Secondly, are the case rates going so high that they risk a big surge in hospitalisations? Third, are hospitalisations and deaths at a low level? And fourth, is there a new variant that could knock all this on track? And on the first 3 of those, we're in great shape. On the 4th, it's much more of a risk.
OK, and if, God forbid, those numbers are bad, at that date, do you look back at the restrictions being lifted tomorrow and think again about those?
Well, we don't want to do that. You know, the strategy...
You don't want to. I'm just wondering, is that the moment that you might have to do that? Well, if the data is bad.
I've learned during this pandemic not to rule anything out, but that is not what we're looking to do. What I'd say, by contrast, is the strategy is on track, because the strategy is to replace the restrictions with vaccination as our main defence against this virus, alongside testing, especially where you see spikes. And that strategy remains on track because of the increasing evidence that this vaccine works against this new so-called Indian variant.
That said, given what we know now, do you regret not putting India on the red list on the May the 9th? April the 9th, I beg your pardon.
Oh, on April the 9th?
On April the 9th,
well,
you didn't put India on the red list.
Well, you see, back then, this variant was not even a variant under investigation. So you can only base your decisions on what you know at the time.
But surely case numbers in the countries you are putting on the red list really matter. I've got a little graphic here. We can remind ourselves on that date. There were 20-odd cases per million in Pakistan. Pakistan went on the red list. In Bangladesh, there were more than 40 cases. Bangladesh went on the red list. On India, there were 84 cases per million in India. And India did not go on the red list. And that, to a lot of people, seems frankly bonkers.
No, so this data is the wrong way of looking at it. And I've heard that you use this, and you used it as if it were fact with one of the journalists. Let me explain. This data depends on how much testing there is, and there's far more testing in India than in Bangladesh or Pakistan. So the decision that we took on putting Bangladesh and Pakistan on the red list on the 9th of April, that was taken on the basis of the positivity rate of people coming to this country, because we now have a surveillance system at the border that is in fact often better than the domestic surveillance in many countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh. Now, you've asked me about the data, so I'll answer it. Okay. And that data showing the proportion of people testing positive who were coming to this country showed that the proportion was 3 times higher amongst people coming from Pakistan than Bangladesh. It then started to rise amongst people coming from India, and so we put India on the red list too.
And by that delay, 20,000 people came in from India during that period. And according to Public Health England, another piece of data, 122 of them were carrying the virus. So if the system was working, that would not have happened. Well, the system cannot have been working for them to come in.
On the contrary. We have some of the strongest defences at the border. All those people had to go through that testing regime, and they had to go through self-isolation. And you only know all these facts because we have this high-quality surveillance at the border. And but I come back to
why is it spreading then?
Well, I come back to this central point. We can only take decisions based on the evidence that we have at the time. And the evidence we had at the time was that the positivity of people coming from India was low at the start of April, and it then rose, and when we saw it rising, we brought in the red list restrictions. That was before we knew about this new variant as a variant, even a variant under investigation,
but
which is the stage before it's a variant.
We do know about it now. I go back to my first question. Given that, do you regret not putting India on the red list on the 9th of April?
Well, throughout this pandemic, I've had these Captain Hindsight questions, and what I'm telling you is how we took the decisions at the time based on the evidence that we had at the time.
What I'd put to you is that actually the border system isn't nearly as effective as you have been assuming and telling people it is. And I'm going to quote you somebody called Lucy Morton, who's the professional officer for the Immigration Services Union. And she says, this is from the front line, a lot of the border and quarantine controls are based on trust. We trust people when they say they've not been in the red list country in the last 10 days. We trust people when they say they're going to number 2 Acacia Avenue to quarantine. We trust that there is an Acacia Avenue and that they're going to do what they said they were going to do when they get there. And frankly, that's not been happening. Far too many people have been getting through these borders with or without a virus in their blood and have been spreading around the country, and our system is not keeping them out.
Well, I don't know who this person is, but...
Well, she's a senior member of the Immigration Services Association.
The trade union.
Yes.
But what she says isn't true, because we have an isolation assurance service that goes and checks that people are isolating. People are required to fill in tests and to fill in a form before they travel. We then check that people aren't coming from somewhere different. So we have a whole system in place to tackle this.
The Home Secretary admits in a letter that she didn't get through to a quarter. They couldn't get through to a quarter of the people coming through they wanted to contact. The Immigration Services Union again says they're catching 100 fake PCR tests every day. The ONS surveyed international arrivals last year, and they found 29% of them had left their accommodation at least once when they were meant to be self-isolating, and so on. There is so much evidence that this system is much leakier and more fragile than it's said to be.
Well, you just said in that evidence that we catch 100 people a day who are attempting to break the rules.
Yeah, but
and we catch them. So that's great.
You don't catch.
So it is very important that these systems are robust. We brought in the hotel quarantine for the countries where we have the highest degree of risk, which India is now on. And we have these very robust processes with the assurance that goes with them for the so-called amber list countries. And that's the approach that we take at the borders. As I say, it's one of the most robust in the world. And because of the data that we get through it, we can spot these problems.
In simple terms, if it was so good, if it was working so well, we wouldn't have the Indian variant spreading so fast as we do.
Well, the numbers of original cases that have led to some of these big increases are relatively small, and what's happened is that you've then had community spread here. The task now is to tackle that by using the mass surge testing that we have and we're putting in place. 35,000 people are being reached this weekend in Bolton alone. And then the critical thing is the vaccination programme that comes with it.
If it's 50% more transmissible, as Sage suggests, is it possible to stop this becoming the dominant variant in this country?
I think it's quite likely that this will become the dominant variant. We don't, as John Edmunds was saying earlier, we don't know exactly how much more transmissible it is, but I think it is likely that this will become the dominant variant here. What that reinforces is the importance of people coming forward for testing and being careful, because this isn't over yet. But the good news is, because we have increasing confidence that the vaccine works against the variant, the strategy is on track. It's just, the virus has just gained a bit of pace, and we've got to therefore we've all got to be that much more careful and cautious.
Was it appropriate for the former Minister Brooks Newmark to lobby you at the height of the pandemic for a contract worth hundreds of millions of pounds?
Yes, it was absolutely appropriate for people to get in contact with anybody at the Department for Health when the country desperately needed PPE, and I sent this contact straight onto the PPE team, and they looked at it. I don't have anything to do with the award of contracts.
Did he get special treatment as a result of that?
No, I just pinged it on. Now, but of course, we had a...
You say you pinged it on.
Yeah.
Your aide on the 28th of May wrote to Lord Dayton, who's in charge of all of this stuff, and says, please see below from the former MP Brooks Newmark, an excellent PPE proposal. The Health Secretary and I would be very grateful if Lord Dayton could look into it urgently. Now, had you looked enough at that proposal to know that it was excellent and had to be seen urgently?
Well, what I can tell you, Andrew, is that we had a process...
That's a recommendation.
Well, we had a process in place to ensure that when there were opportunities to get hold of PPE, to save lives on the front line, that they were looked at rapidly. And in this case, we ended up with 90 million goggles for people in the NHS as a result of this approach. And so I'm not going to...
It just looks, I mean, there'll be other people who could provide goggles. It just looks as if you have a contact with Matt Hancock or Boris Johnson or another minister, you get preferential treatment and you get pushed ahead.
No, that's not true, because there was this process for making sure that when there were high-quality offers that they could be taken up rapidly. That process was open to everybody, and many, many people came through that process, and the result was we saved lives on the front line. And at no point did we have a national outage of PPE, and I'm incredibly proud of my team that pulled that off. But of course, when somebody approaches the Health Secretary in the middle of a pandemic, when you're desperately short of PPE, it's perfectly reasonable for the Health Secretary then to send on the email and say, can we have a look at this? And then I didn't have anything to do with the signing of any of these contracts.
But you made it pretty clear what you thought about this proposal. You thought it was excellent.
I wanted it to be looked at. And by the way, 90 million goggles later, I'm glad that I did.
So you'd read and looked at the proposal before you sent it forward?
Well, I sent it, as you can see, and said this is one for the PPE team, and that's the right thing to do.
All right, let me ask about the future of vaccinations then.
Yeah.
Because in those areas which are having a particularly hard time at the moment, there is a call for surge vaccinations.
Yes.
Professor Donna Hall, who's head of the Bolton NHS Trust, absolutely the epicentre of this. She says, in Bolton, our rate increases by 20 to 30% every day. Surge vaccination is now urgent.
Yes.
Are you going to be pushing surge vaccination?
Yes. So we're putting in extra vaccinators. We're opening a new vaccination site in Bolton tomorrow. We want everybody in Bolton who is eligible to come forward. And also this coming week, we're going to be opening up vaccination to the 35s and over across the country, because this isn't just about accelerating the vaccination programme in Bolton, it's about going as fast as we possibly can nationwide.
Let me move a long way from Bolton to Gaza. You've seen the pictures, you've seen what's happening there, you've seen attacks on journalistic institutions in Gaza. What now needs to be done by friendly countries such as Britain to de-escalate what is becoming a very serious situation?
Well, of course, we've all seen the pictures, and we want to see a de-escalation of the situation in Gaza. I'm very glad that the United States are taking a lead on this and making sure that they try to bring the two sides together to seek that de-escalation.
All All right, Matt Hancock, thanks very much indeed for joining us today. And thanks to all my guests. Thanks you to watching. And I'll be back here again at 9 o'clock next week. God willing. Goodbye. Thank you.